something that you want to keep in mind that might not be apparent to you upon first reading Rene Descartes' Discourse on Method, same thing would go for his meditations too, by the way, is that he is actually a master storyteller. He is a great philosopher, and he's putting together some really brilliant ideas and exploring some new paths in metaphysics, even in morals. But he's framing them within a narrative structure. And it's worth spending a little bit of time on looking at how that's supposed to work, what's going on in the text. And that's not being unphilosophical. It's actually, you might say, a prerequisite to fully understand the philosophical import about what's going on. So, if we wanted to say what kind of story is being told here, it's a quest. It's a narrative about seeking something that isn't necessarily lost from the beginning, but certainly isn't possessed, something that is yet to be found. And it's a quest for knowledge. It's an epistemological quest, we can say. It's an epistemological inquiry. Quest is better because it gives us the sense that, look, somebody's actually throwing themselves into it. They're not just sitting back in their armchair, as Descartes himself is going to deride, speculating about this sort of stuff. He's engaged in a practical process, and he wants knowledge. He wants to possess certainty. He wants to be secure in saying that the knowledge that he possesses is really knowledge. He'll talk a little bit later about what exactly his greatest desire was. In part 1, he says, I always had an extreme desire to learn to distinguish the true from the false. Being able to distinguish the true from the false, that's what knowledge in large part consists in. Being able to say, that's right, that's wrong. This person over here doesn't know what they're talking about. This person over here does know what they're talking about. But why? In order to see clearly in my actions and proceed with confidence in this life. So it's not a merely speculative armchair exercise that he's carrying out. This is something that's supposed to pertain to a person's entire, what we might call, human condition. Their own way of living out the universal human condition. And that brings us to another important point. Who's the main character of this? It's what we might call an everyman. An ordinary person. Descartes himself, who is far from an ordinary person, is going to put on the persona, or put on the mask, of being the average Joe, or if you like, the average Josephine, right? Being just a rational human being like anybody else. Now, why is he doing that? We'll come back to that moment. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's look at how he does that first. So he says, this is in the beginning of part 1. There's a power of judging well and distinguishing what is true from what is false. That's good sense or reason. And that's naturally equal in all people. Everybody possesses it to some degree, actually the same degree, but do they use it to the same extent? That's the key distinguisher there. So he says the diversity of our opinions doesn't arise because some people are more reasonable than others. Everybody's just as reasonable as anybody else. The question is whether they use that faculty of reason properly, whether they use their mind the way that they ought to. That's part of what the discourse is going to be teaching us about, is how one ought to use their mind. So when Descartes tells us later on that, oh, I'm not prescribing rules for everybody, I'm just telling you how it worked for me, there's a little bit of cover-up going on there. He's being what we call disingenuous. He's not really just trying to tell us his own story. He's trying to tell us the story about how anybody who's got something on the ball and doesn't have some terrible impediments can arrive at certainty and truth. So he says, the only thing that makes us different and distinguishes us from the animals is what distinguishes all of us from the animals, and it distinguishes us equally. That is, the faculty of reason. It's entirely complete in each person. So we're all on the same level ground as far as Descartes in the story is concerned. So he's going to say, look, this is what I could do. You could be doing the same thing as well. He tells us that he doesn't feel himself to be extraordinary. My mind was not more perfect than the ordinary mind. There's a lot of people smarter than me, whose thoughts are quicker, whose imagination is clearer and distinct, whose memory is more well stocked with experiences. So why is he doing that? Why is he concealing from us the fact that he really is a genius? Well, there's a rhetorical force in saying this sort of thing, and you see it in infomercials. You see it when people say, this scheme worked for me, and it can work for you just as well, now purchase it. Except Descartes' not trying to get anybody to buy anything. He's trying to offer something to them which he thinks is actually going to make their life better, which he thinks is going to allow them to get away from illusions, from doubts, from uncertainties, and finally attain true knowledge about things, not only about speculative or theoretical matters, but about how we ought to run our own lives. So it works. Instead of him sort of preaching from above down to us, he's saying, let's go along on this journey. So let's see how it actually works out for him. He begins by talking about his education, which he summarizes by saying it was an education of books, meaning that books were used as the primary repository of knowledge, and the work of the instructor was to comment on the text, to lead the students through it, to get them to imbibe and assimilate the knowledge that was provided to them within the texts. And these are all the subjects that he in fact studied as a student in this Jesuit school of Le Havre when he's a kid, and also in the university. He goes on and he studies law in the university and studies a lot of other things too on the way. He doesn't find this to be satisfactory. And we'll talk about why, and we'll look at why in just a moment. So he does something quite reasonable. He says, well, if the truth, the certainty, the knowledge that I wanted wasn't there in books, where else can I look for it? And there's two places that make good sense. Examining himself and looking at what he calls the book of the world. Now, this is not a new concept that he comes up with. It's a trope that had been around for quite a while. But the idea is you can travel. Books are like traveling back in time or traveling to other cultures. He says it's like a conversation with the best minds that we have available. You read Aristotle, you're having a conversation with Aristotle if you're doing your job as a reader. When you're reading Descartes, you should be having a conversation with Descartes, not just sort of passively just letting the letters hit you and saying, oh yes, whatever he says. But there's something lacking there. They're not really our contemporaries. If we go around in the world that we live in, we might be able to learn a lot more. We can also turn inward and examine ourselves. We can pay attention to what works for us, where we make stupid mistakes, what went on when we made a stupid mistake, how we can avoid making it again. All of that is going beyond what we're going to get out of books. That's not going to satisfy him either, and he's going to move on to something else after that. But that's in the other parts, and we'll get to that in a moment. Let's come back now to looking at his book learning, his educational, his pedagogical process. And he tells us that he was nourished on literature from the time of his childhood. Why? Well, because people persuaded him that through literature one could acquire a clear and assured understanding of everything useful in life. Now, isn't that similar to what we tell people about going to college today? Go to college. After you do that, things will fall into place and you'll have a good job and you'll be able to understand what's going on. Not like those uneducated, ignorant people over there. It's kind of interesting because there's a lot of people who have a lot better sense than those who have gone to college because they spent some time working in the world and learned something about human nature in the process. But we do sell this line to a lot of people. Look, if you just study this stuff, you'll eventually figure it all out. It'll make sense to you. There's an implicit promise like that in our own time with these websites like, say, Wikipedia. And I'm not knocking Wikipedia, you know. It's a useful source for some things, but it shouldn't be your go-to for everything. It shouldn't substitute for your brain. It shouldn't be the memory system that you rely upon, in part because, you know, there's all sorts of problems with how it's edited. The articles are, in fact, getting better, but there's still errors in some of them. And unless you actually know the subject material, you don't know where the errors are. But Descartes is in a position where a lot of people are. You know, the encyclopedia has what I want. The library has what I want. My teachers have what I want. I can go to a book, which is put together by somebody smart, after all, and if I just study that well enough and learn that discipline, learn that science that's being taught in that book well enough, I will actually have mastered something that's useful for me. Now, I do need to say something about this word science over here that we're seeing used. The science, we're used to thinking of the sciences in terms of physics, chemistry, you know, biology, what we call the natural sciences, or computer science, or in terms of applied things like engineering, or in terms of what we call the social sciences. In French, they're called the human sciences. In German, they're called the mental or spiritual sciences, the Geisteswissenschaften, like sociology and psychology and anthropology. And we don't normally think of something like philosophy or theology or literature as being a science. Well, that's because the word science has a broader reference in Descartes. It means a systematic body of knowledge that is organized, that can provide us with answers to what it is that we need to know. So we could add in here things like computer sciences or mechanics that he talks about as well. But these are all what he is willing to call sciences. So you've got to do a little bit of adaptation of your mind if you're really stuck in the model of the term science that we use today in the English-speaking world. That's just sort of a side note. Now, he talks about having been educated in all of these. And they all provide us with something. What they don't provide us with is knowledge. So let's look first at what he says that they do provide us with. He says, I was in one of the most famous schools in Europe. There were erudite people who were teaching me. I learned everything which the others learned there, and I even went out and read other books. So I really ran through the entire gamut of what was available. What did I learn? So literature or languages. I knew that the languages one learns there are necessary for the understanding of ancient books. Okay, so if you want to be able to read Sophocles in the Greek, you got to read Greek. If you want to be able to read Descartes in the original Latin, you got to read Latin, right? If you want to read Descartes in French, you got to read French. Languages are good to know, not just so you can go find the bathroom or order at a restaurant, but so you can open up the world of literature, because, you know, there can quite often be a lot lost in the translation, and unless you know the language, you can't tell what's been lost. What does literature provide us with? He talks about fables. So he says, fables, the gracefulness of them awakens the intellect. The memorable actions of history raise the mind, and if one reads with discretion, help to form one's judgment. So, you know, if we're reading, say, history of World War II, and we're reading about Patton. I'm not a huge admirer of Patton, but, you know, there's some things about him that I did like. And you could draw from his example things, you know, I should do this, and maybe I shouldn't do this. Don't slap soldiers who have shell shock, or something like that. So you're deriving some sort of benefit from it. And this is where he says that reading these books is like having a conversation with the greatest minds that are available. Eloquence or rhetoric has an incomparable power and beauty. That is the ability to use language. You think about speech writing, for example, or if you had to take a speech class. That's what rhetoric is, learning how to speak well. Or if you go to Toastmasters, right? That's also the same sort of thing. Poetry has a most ravishing delicacy and softness. Not the most enticing recommendation there, but what he's talking about is reading literary works. If you've ever read a book and you've been captivated by the language of it, that's what he's talking about in terms of poetry. As a matter of fact, if you've ever been listening to a song, and it's not just an earworm, but it's really meaningful to you, and it allows you to sort of, figure out how you ought to approach things or how you ought to think about things, or even to anticipate things, that would fall under what he's talking about as poetry. So all of those are nice, but notice none of those have provided knowledge. What about these things? Mathematics, moral, theology, philosophy. He says, mathematics has very skillful inventions, which can go a long way to satisfying the curious, as well as facilitating all the arts and lessening the work of men. That's an interesting way to talk about mathematics, isn't it? When you had to study math in K through 12, and you got kind of bored with it, as I did, and your teacher would say, this is going to be useful for you someday, you may have thought, well, sure, I'll balance my checkbook or something like that. Descartes is talking about things that go way, way beyond that. And if you proceed far enough into mathematics, it actually has a certain kind of beauty and elegance of its own that can be extremely appealing. What about the study of morals or ethics? That can also be useful as well. The writings which deal with morals contain several lessons and a number of exhortations to virtue, which are extremely useful. So, morals is good for telling us, shape up, don't be a bad person. You could think about, for example, Google with their "Don't Be Evil" motto. That's, what he's talking about as morals. Theology, what does that teach us? How to get to heaven. Isn't that nice? Philosophy provides a way of speaking plausibly on all matters and making oneself admired by those who are less scholarly. Notice he doesn't say philosophy provides you with truth. He says philosophy lets you talk about all sorts of things, and people who don't really know any better, people who aren't, as well informed as you are, will probably think that you know what you're talking about. Now, that is not a recommendation of philosophy as Descartes has encountered it into his own time. And then he talks about some other arts as well. Jurisprudence, that's law, medicine. These all bring honor and riches to those who cultivate them. Notice, again, none of these have actually provided us with what we can call reliable, certain knowledge. They've all provided us with other types of goods, but not the good of truth, not the good of certainty, not the good of knowledge. Descartes says it's good to have examined all of them in order to know their legitimate value and to guard against being wrong. Now let's talk about what problems they have. So he says, literature, like fables, for example, they make us imagine several totally impossible events as possible. So if, for example, we're reading Greek plays, or we're looking at, what else would fall under this? We're thinking about, stories that are told, fiction. We're going to be sort of deforming our minds, according to Descartes, so that we think that things that aren't really the case are the way that things turn out to be in real life. Imagine if you were nourished on a diet only of action movies, so you thought that the way to solve things, you just punch people in the face, or talk real tough to them. Well, that's not going to get you very far, and that sort of thing can work in the movies, but it doesn't really work in real life. Romance movies, great example too. Imagine if you ran your life, your dating life, according to the romance movies that are out there. You'd probably get thrown in prison for being a stalker with some of them. So literature is really not going to give us what we want, and it's kind of leading us astray. Even history. Descartes says history's pretty good because at least they stick to what actually happened. but they leave things out. So he says, even if they don't change or increase the importance of things, they omit the most menial and less admirable circumstances. So what is left does not depict the truth. History is already a kind of editing that's going on. So history doesn't really provide us with the truth either. What about poetry and rhetoric? He says, I placed great value on eloquence. I was in love with poetry. But I thought that they were gifts given to the mind rather than fruits of study. So what Descartes is saying is that these are not things that you can really teach a person. They're just sort of like skills that some people have and other people don't. Some people have the genius for them, other people don't. And so you can't really teach somebody how to become a good poet. You can't even teach somebody how to be a good orator. They either are or they aren't, and there's not much that you can do one way or the other. So that's not going to provide us with knowledge. What about mathematics? This is going to be an important one for Descartes, because mathematics provides him with a model of what really is clear and distinct knowledge. He says, I found it delightful because of the certainty and clarity of its reasoning. I didn't yet notice its true use. Its true use is going to get rolled into philosophy and come out of it. So he says, I thought it was just useful for mechanical arts, making technology, making things that would work for us, thinking about how to make artifacts like this chalkboard. And Descartes really did go quite far with mathematics, you have to remember. He invented Cartesian coordinates. Then he talks about morality, morals, ethics. And he says that the writings of the ancient pagans that deal with morality are like superb and magnificent palaces built on nothing but sand and mud. They don't actually have a foundation. They talk about virtue, but they don't really know what it is. And if they don't know what it is, they might actually be doing something that's more harmful than helpful. Theology, that's beyond me, Descartes says. And this is sort of a way of seeming to place it above himself, but at the same time putting it at a distance and saying, yeah, I don't know anything about this God stuff. That's beyond me. That's supernatural. I'm just going to stick with what I can actually know because, I'm just an ordinary guy. You priests or you ministers, you do what you like with that. And get back to me in the end when you've got the answers about that. That's a good way of saying, I'm not going to have anything to do with you guys. This is not going to be what I'm going to focus on. What about philosophy? So here he says two really important things to us. One is that philosophy, he says, it's been cultivated for several centuries by the most excellent minds that had ever lived. But there is still nothing in it that was not disputed and which was thus not still in doubt. So if there are more than one available philosophical positions that reasonable people can take, Descartes is saying that's a sign that philosophy is not really at the level of a science yet. If it had attained true knowledge, certainty, then there really only would be one philosophy available. All the other ones would be wrong, and you'd say, look, don't bother with that stuff. Here's the one philosophy that's true. Since we're not at that point, we can't say that philosophy can actually provide us with knowledge. Here's why that's a problem. This is point number 2. All these other disciplines, insofar as they are scientific, guess what they depend on? Philosophy. Now, why is that? I mean, you might say, I've never studied philosophy in my life, and I've been studying this field, social work, or, psychology, or business, or pick whatever you like, for, 4 years in college. This is the first philosophy class I've had to take. Why would you say that anything is based on philosophy? Well, because if you actually take any discipline and you look at its foundations, first of all, historically, many of these other disciplines actually came out of philosophy. All the natural sciences originally were called natural philosophy. They still were in Descartes' time. Mathematics has a sort of semi-independent status. Medicine has a semi-independent status, but there's a lot of blending together in ancient times already between those. And most of the ologies that you can run across came out of philosophy historically at one point. And you might say, well, you know, they left behind that philosophical mumbo-jumbo stuff, and now they're truly scientific. Well, when you get to their foundational concepts, quite often, you're no longer doing that discipline, you're doing philosophy. So sociology, for example. How do you know that the concepts that you're working with really correspond to something out there in the world? That's not a sociological question. That's an epistemological question. That's a question of philosophy. How should you behave as a professional in your field? That's a question in ethics. That's a question in philosophy. What is your field really working with? What is the subject matter when you get down to it? That's a metaphysical question. That's philosophy. So Descartes is calling our attention to the fact that if philosophy hasn't got its house in order, that's a problem for all the other disciplines. They can go on doing what they do, but they've just been lucky so far. They're working in the realm of opinion, not the realm of true knowledge. So it becomes a key project to get this philosophy stuff right. And if we can't get it from the books, we can't get it from previous education, where are we going to get it? So here's where we go on, and Descartes says, I'm going to look at other sources. I'm going to look inside myself, look into the great book of the world. I'm going to travel around, I'm going to get some practical experience. And what does he do? He doesn't just wander around and look at stuff, he thinks about it, he reflects on it, he tests himself according to those things. So he says, it seemed to me I could arrive at more truth in the reasoning each man makes concerning the matters that are important to him and in which events could punish him soon afterwards if he judged badly, than in the reasoning made by a man of letters in his study. So Descartes says, I'm going to go and travel the world. And he does so. He becomes a mercenary. He doesn't do much fighting, actually, but he travels around. And he's constantly observing people. He says, I observed courts and peoples and events, and what did I realize? He says, I examined the customs of other people. I found as much diversity among them as among the opinions of the philosophers. So, could I learn anything from that? Sure, I could learn something. Don't trust any of those customs, because they're not going to provide you with knowledge. You know, think about this. How do we know, as Americans, that the American way, whatever that means, is actually the right way? Or that our perspective is the right perspective? Should we be concerned about the American dream? Should we take the Constitution, whether we're understanding that in a conservative way or a liberal way, both of which are actually deformations of it, as, you know, some sort of document for how we ought to live? Well, what evidence do we have for those things? What grounding, what foundation do we have for thinking that the customs that comprise our way of life is the best one, the necessary one? If we're Cartesians about this, we would study abroad, and then we would come back and we'd say, you know, the French do things this way, the Tanzanians do things this way, the Vietnamese do things this way, and we'd actually be smart enough to say, well, in parts of France they do it this way, in other parts they do it this way, and in parts of Vietnam they do it this way, in other parts they do it that way. We'd recognize diversity there. And we would say our own way of looking at things is circumscribed and is not therefore to be trusted as certain knowledge. So he says, I learned not to believe too firmly in anything which I had been persuaded to believe merely by example and custom. So I freed myself of errors, and I allowed myself to be open to something else. Notice at this point he doesn't have knowledge. The question is, after I do that, what is going to provide me with knowledge? And you might say, so far it's all been negative. But it's not just negative. If you don't actually try out what it is that education can offer you, if, for example, you were just going to say, well, you know, Rene Descartes told me that I don't have to actually read any books because, look, you know, it didn't help him out. That would not be a smart way to go. Descartes is saying, try these out, see how far they can get you, but you're not going to find that they actually provide you with certainty. And then go around in the world, try that out, see if you can find certainty by looking at yourself, by looking at the world. And after that hasn't worked for you, now you're ready to move on to something that might actually yield you the thing that you desire, knowledge.